Night after night, he'd sleep beside me while I silently wept, praying my daughter would never uncover the truth hidden behind closed doors. Yet fate, in its cruel irony, had other plans. In the end, it was she who betrayed me in the most devastating way imaginable. Hello, my name is Margaret, and today, at 75, I've finally found the courage to share a story I once believed I'd never tell. Before we begin, I'd appreciate it if everyone watching could please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. This truly helps me continue bringing these memories to you. My story starts in 1969 when I was 34. It might seem odd by today's standards, but back then, a woman of 34, especially one with a teenage daughter like me, was already considered almost old. Rachel, my daughter, was 14. A beautiful, brilliant girl with a promising future. Her brown eyes were just like mine, but her smile was David's, her father's. A smile I eventually learned to fear. We lived in a small town in rural Kansas, one of those places where everyone knows everyone, and secrets are kept tucked behind polite smiles at Sunday service. On the surface, we were the epitome of a perfect family. David, a respected man who worked at the town bank, always impeccable in his suit and tie. I was the homemaker who also did some seamstress work for the local ladies. Rachel was a top student, played piano at church recitals, and dated the pharmacist's son, a good boy her parents approved of. But inside our home, the reality was brutally different. David started drinking during our first year of marriage. At first, it was just on weekends. Then, it became almost every day. He'd come home reeking of bourbon, eyes bloodshot, tie loosened. In the early years, he'd just yell, "Break," things, humiliate me with sharp words. "You're worthless, Margaret," he'd sneer. "Look at this house, this food. You can't even get that right." I endured it in silence. Back in 1969, a divorced woman was seen as a failure, a disgrace to the family. My own mother would tell me, "Marriage is like that, dear. Men have strong temperaments. We have to know how to handle it." And handle it I did, swallowing my tears, hiding the purple marks on my arms when he graduated from words to physical violence. Rachel grew up in that environment. I tried to shield her as best I could, sending her to sleepovers at friends' houses. When I sensed David was worse than usual, I made up excuses for the bruises. "I bumped into the table, honey. I slipped in the bathroom. It's nothing, just an allergic reaction." But children notice, don't they? Even without fully understanding, she knew something was wrong. The situation gradually worsened, like water slowly coming to a boil. You know the analogy. You put the frog in cold water and heat it slowly. It doesn't even realize it's dying until it's too late. That's how it was for me for almost 15 years. Each day a little worse than the last, but never so dramatically different, that it gave me the courage to take my daughter and run. Until that night. I'll never forget it. June 17th, 1969, a Tuesday. It was raining hard, one of those winter rains that make everything dark, even in the middle of the afternoon. David came home soaked and furious because he'd lost a promotion at the bank. Before even closing the door, he started yelling. He threw his briefcase on the table, knocking over the vase my mother had given me. It broke into 1,000 pieces, just like my life that night. Rachel was in the living room, doing her math homework. She looked up frightened when her father entered yelling. "Go to your room," I whispered to her. But David saw, and that only made him angrier. "Stay right there, girl," he bellowed. "It's about time you learned what real life is like, not this fantasy your mother thinks she lives." It was the first time he did that in front of our daughter. The slaps, the pushing, the names he called me, things a 14-year-old girl should never hear being said to her own mother. When I tried to defend myself, he pushed me against the wall so hard I couldn't breathe. Rachel started crying, begging him to stop. That's when David turned to her, eyes bloodshot, and said something that froze my blood. "Stop crying, you spoiled brat. One of these days I'll teach you how to be a real woman. since your mother can't even do that." At that moment, something inside me broke, and at the same time, strengthened. It was as if all the invisible chains that bound me to that life had been cut at once. It was no longer about me, about what I could endure. It was about my daughter, about what I wouldn't allow to happen to her. I waited for David to fall asleep, drunk as always. I took Rachel, who was still shaking after that scene, and whispered, "Pack a small bag, just the essentials. We're leaving tonight." Her eyes widened. "Where to, Mom?" "To Chicago. Your Aunt Sarah will shelter us until we find a place." You should have seen her face. It was as if she'd been slapped. "I can't leave. What about school? What about my friends? What about Michael?" Michael was her boyfriend, the pharmacist's son. First love. You know how it is. "Rachel." I held her hands, trembling as much as she was. "Either we leave now, or I don't know what might happen next time." She cried silently while packing her bag. She took the photo with her friends, her diary, some clothes. She left behind her childhood teddy bear. "I'm too old for that," she said, but I saw how her eyes lingered on it. That night marked the end of her childhood in many ways. We left the house at 3 a.m., with the little money I'd hidden over the years, my insurance for an emergency I prayed I'd never need to use. We caught the first Greyhound bus to Chicago at 5 a.m. I remember Rachel sitting beside me, looking out the window as our town disappeared in the morning fog. She didn't say a word during the entire 8-hour trip, but the silent tears never stopped flowing. When the bus pulled into the Chicago station, she finally turned to me with a look I'll never forget, a mixture of pain, anger, and accusation that pierced my soul like a knife. "You destroyed my life," she said, each word slow and loaded with resentment. "Everything I knew, my friends, my boyfriend, my school, it's all over because of you." Those words were branded on me like hot iron. At the time, I tried to explain it was for her own good, to protect us. But how do you explain something like that to a 14-year-old who just had her world turned upside down? To her, I wasn't a heroine saving her from danger. I was the villain who had ripped away everything she loved. And so began our new life in Chicago, carrying not just the few bags we'd managed to bring, but also the weight of that resentment that, without my knowing, would grow silently like cancer in the years to come until it exploded in the worst possible way. The first months in Chicago were like living in a different world. We left a small town where the biggest noise was the church bell ringing at 6 p.m. for a metropolis that never slept, with horns, sirens, and the constant rumble of buses. Everything was too big, too fast, too scary. My sister Sarah received us with an open heart, but her apartment was tiny. 1 bedroom, living room, and kitchen combined on the 3rd floor of an old building in Pilsen. We improvised a mattress in the living room for Rachel and me. "It's temporary," I'd say every night before sleeping, more to convince myself than to comfort her. She'd just turn to the side, pretending not to hear me. We'd wake up at 5 a.m. in the dark. I'd prepare a quick coffee while Rachel got ready. For her new school, a public school, very different from the Catholic school she'd attended in Kansas. "The girls here are different, Mom," she told me after the first week. "They talk about things I didn't even know existed." The sparkle in her eyes that I knew so well seemed to have gone out. While she went to school, I took 2 buses to get to the garment factory where Sarah had gotten me a position. I'll never forget the deafening noise of the industrial machines, the smell of new fabric mixed with sweat, the cotton dust that stuck in your throat. I'd sit at 7 a.m. on a hard chair with 20 other women, each bent over her sewing machine. We'd work until 6 with just half an hour for lunch. My hands, which before had only sewn delicate dresses for the church ladies, now mended hundreds of identical pieces every day. My fingers bled frequently when the needle slipped. We didn't have time to cry about the pain. The supervisor kept an eye on the clock, on the number of pieces each one delivered per hour. "Faster, Margaret," he'd say, passing behind me. "There's a line of women wanting your spot." The salary was small, but combined with the small help Sarah gave us, we managed to survive. Gradually, I saved enough money to rent a back room in a family house in Little Village. It was small with a tiny bathroom, but it was ours. The first place we could call home since we'd fled in the middle of the night. Rachel remained distant. She did what I asked. She went to school, helped with household chores, studied when I insisted, but there was an invisible wall between us. Sometimes, near her birthday or Christmas, I'd catch her crying softly, looking at the only photo she'd brought of her friends. "They're just memories," I'd say, trying to comfort her. "We need to look forward." "What future?" she answered once, with eyes hardened by someone who'd grown up too fast. "Sewing until my fingers fall off like you?" That hurt more than any of David's slaps, because deep down, there was a grain of truth I couldn't deny. What future was I offering? My daughter? A life of privation, hard work, far from everything she knew and loved. The months turned into years. 1970, 1971. Time passed without mercy. Rachel grew. She was no longer that 14-year-old girl. At 17, she was finishing high school, working part-time at a stationery store near home. She'd made some friends, adapted to life in the big city, but that initial resentment never completely disappeared. It just transformed into something quieter, more calculated. It was in mid-1972 that things began to change. After 3 years of that daily struggle, I was promoted to supervisor at the factory. The salary improved a bit. Working conditions, too. I didn't need to sew 10 hours a day anymore. Now I coordinated the work of other seamstresses, checked the quality of pieces, did production control. That's where I met Andrew. He'd just been hired as the factory's administrative manager. A man of almost 40, widowed, no children, always impeccably dressed, educated, with a calm way of speaking that reminded me of David in the early days, before drinking transformed him into that monster. Andrew started spending more time in the production area, always with some excuse to come talk to me. "Mrs. Margaret, we need to review these numbers. Mrs. Margaret, could you help me with the quality report?" The other factory women soon noticed and started teasing. "Look there, Margaret, the boss can't take his eyes off you." I'd blush, change the subject. At 37, after a failed marriage and 3 years of struggling to survive, romance was the last thing on my mind. Besides, I had Rachel to consider. She was no longer a child, but she still needed me, still depended on me financially while finishing her studies. Even so, when Andrew invited me for coffee after work, I couldn't refuse. It was just an innocent coffee at the diner across from the factory. We talked about work, about life in Chicago. He told me he was from rural Iowa, that he'd come to the capital after his wife died of pneumonia. "I know what it's like to start from scratch," he said, holding his cup with hands that seemed to have never known hard labor. "You think you won't make it, that the pain is too great. But one day you wake up and realize you survived another day, and then another, and another." Something in those words touched my heart in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. It was as if, for the first time in years, someone really saw me, not as the seamstress, the single mother, the woman who fled from her husband, but as Margaret, just Margaret. The coffees became a weekly habit. Then came Sunday lunches, walks in the park. Andrew was kind, attentive, patient. He never raised his voice, never showed impatience, never made me feel less. He brought small gifts, a book, chocolate, a flower, simple gestures that were rebuilding the trust David had shattered. I told Rachel about Andrew after almost 2 months of dating him. She looked at me for a long time with an expression I couldn't decipher. "Do you really like him, Mom?" she finally asked. "I do," I replied, feeling my face heat up like a teenager's. "He's good for me." She shrugged, returning her attention to the notebook where she was taking notes. "Just be careful, men are all the same in the end." That response worried me, so cynical for someone so young. I realized the wounds left by David weren't just mine. Rachel also carried scars, some I didn't even know about. Maybe her bitterness wasn't just about the move, about losing friends and her previous life. Maybe it was something deeper, a fear that looked too much like mine. Andrew asked to meet her. I organized a simple dinner in our small room. I cooked the best I could with our few resources. Andrew arrived punctually, bringing a chocolate cake from the bakery and a poetry book for Rachel. He'd noticed in my stories that she liked to read. Dinner was awkward. Andrew made an effort, asking questions about school, about her plans for the future. Rachel answered politely, but with short, monosyllabic sentences when possible. There was a tension in the air that I couldn't dispel, no matter how hard I tried. At the end of the night, when Andrew said goodbye, he kissed my hand delicately. I saw Rachel's eyes following every gesture, every word, as if she were studying an enemy. "He seems nice," she said after he left, in a tone that completely contradicted the words. "You barely talked to him," I replied, starting to clear the plates. "I don't need to talk much to know what kind of man he is." She picked up the book Andrew had brought, leafing through it distractedly. "They're all charming at first, aren't they? Dad was too, from what you told me." That left me speechless. She was right in a way. David had also been kind, polite, full of small romantic gestures, until he wasn't anymore. Doubt settled in my heart. Was I repeating the same mistake? But Andrew was different. I felt it. In the following 3 months, he proved it in every possible way. He respected my space, my time, my hesitations. When I finally accepted his proposal to date, it was as if a small ray of light entered the difficult life we'd been leading since the escape. Things at home, however, were getting increasingly tense. Rachel, now 17, seemed to resent every minute I spent with Andrew. She made up excuses for me to cancel our meetings, created small emergencies, got mysteriously sick on days we had plans. "Don't you see what's happening?" she said one night after we canceled another dinner because she had a headache. "You're letting him get between us after everything we've been through together." "It's not like that, honey," I tried to explain. "Andrew being in my life doesn't mean I love you less, or that I'm going to abandon you. You already abandoned everything for me once," she replied, her eyes shining with something that seemed like anger, but I'd later understand was something much more dangerous. "Let's see if you'd do it again." I didn't understand what she meant at that moment. I interpreted it as the natural fear of a daughter losing her mother's attention, of being replaced by a new love. If I had really listened, really paid attention to what was between the lines of that conversation, maybe I could have avoided the storm that was coming. When Andrew proposed to me 3 months after we started dating, I didn't hesitate. It was fast, yes, especially by the standards of the time. But at 37, after a failed marriage and years of struggle, I felt I deserved that chance at happiness. He had his own apartment in Lincoln Park, a better neighborhood than ours. We'd have a room just for Rachel, a real living room, a kitchen where I could cook without bumping into the walls. "We're going to be a family," I told Rachel, showing the simple ring Andrew had given me. "A real family." This time she looked at the ring for a long time, then at me. A strange smile formed on her lips, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Of course, Mom," she finally said. "A real family." It was her tone when saying those words that should have alerted me. There was something there, a promise, a threat, a cold determination that went unnoticed in that moment of happiness. I was so focused on the bright future that finally seemed within our reach that I didn't notice the dark clouds forming on the horizon. The wedding was set for 2 months later. It would be something simple at the courthouse with a small lunch. Afterwards, Rachel seemed to have accepted the idea, even offered to help with the preparations. Suddenly she was interested in getting to know Andrew better, in spending time with him. At the time, I interpreted it as a good sign. She was finally accepting that he would be part of our lives. How wrong I was, how terribly, painfully wrong. The wedding was scheduled for the end of July 1972, a simple ceremony at the courthouse. Just me, Andrew, Rachel, and a few friends we'd made during those difficult years in Chicago. The weeks leading up to the wedding were strange. Rachel, who had always been distant with Andrew, suddenly showed interest in getting to know him better. She'd come home early from the stationery store where she worked part-time, ask about his day at the factory, offer to make coffee when he came to visit. "She's finally accepting," I commented to Andrew one night as we walked through the square. After dinner, "I think she understands you're different from her father." Andrew smiled, squeezing my hand between his. "It's natural, Margaret. She's just worried about you. Any daughter would be after what you've been through." How I wanted to believe those words, how I needed to believe that things were finally falling into place, that we'd have the chance to be a normal family without the ghosts of the past haunting us. 2 weeks before the wedding, Rachel asked to talk to Andrew alone. "I want to surprise you on the wedding day, Mom," she explained, her eyes shining in a way that reminded me of the girl she was before everything fell apart. "I need his help." I left the house that afternoon with a light heart, thinking maybe she was planning to sing at the ceremony, or perhaps had saved up to buy a special gift. I went downtown, stopped by the fabric store where a former factory client worked. She'd set aside a piece of lace for the simple dress I was sewing myself for the big day. I came back earlier than planned. The sky had suddenly darkened, announcing one of those summer storms that fall without warning in Chicago. I ran the last blocks, protecting the package with the fabric under my blouse. When I opened the door to our back room, the noise of the rain starting to fall muffled my steps, and then I heard muffled laughter coming from the small bathroom. Andrew's voice, deeper than normal, whispering something I couldn't understand. Rachel's response, my daughter, my 17-year-old girl, in a tone I'd never heard before. My body knew the truth before my mind even processed it. That horrible feeling in my stomach, the cold sweat on my neck, my heart beating so hard it seemed it would tear through my chest. The same feeling I had when David came home drunk years ago. My body recognized danger before my eyes saw it. I let the package with the lace fall to the floor. The noise must have alerted them both, because there was a sudden silence, followed by hurried movements. The bathroom door opened and there they were. Andrew with his shirt unbuttoned, hair disheveled, Rachel with smeared lipstick, the straps of her blouse fallen off her shoulders, the unmistakable air of guilt and something more. I didn't scream, didn't break anything, didn't faint like betrayed. Women in radio melodramas. A strange calm took over me. The same calm I'd felt that night in 1969 when I decided we'd leave David's house forever. "Mom!" Rachel started, but her voice died when she saw my face. There were no tears or despair, just a cold, crystalline certainty. "How long?" I asked, my voice firmer than I ever imagined possible at that moment. They looked at each other, neither wanting to be the first to speak. It was Andrew who broke the silence, rehearsing a clumsy excuse. "Margaret, it's not what you're thinking." I raised my hand, cutting off his words. I asked, "How long?" Rachel stepped forward, her eyes fixed on mine. There was no shame there, just a gleam of triumph that chilled my blood. 2 weeks, she answered, her voice low but clear. Since that day I asked to talk to him alone. It wasn't difficult, you know. He's not as different from Dad as you think. Her words were like knives, each one finding precisely where it hurt most. Andrew tried to approach, stammer some explanation, but my gaze kept him in place. That's when Rachel said something I'll never forget. "Now you know what it's like to lose everything you love all at once. How I felt when you ripped me from my life." In that instant, I understood. It wasn't passion, it wasn't love, it was revenge. A cold, calculated revenge, planned for years. Every forced smile, every silent acceptance of the last few days, all part of a plan to hurt me in the worst possible way. Pack your things, I said to Rachel with a calm I didn't even know where it came from. You have 15 minutes to leave this house. Mom! She exclaimed, the mask of triumph falling for an instant, revealing the frightened girl underneath. Maybe she expected screams, tears, a complete collapse, not that icy firmness. You wanted to act like an adult, Rachel. You wanted to make adult decisions. Now you'll live with the consequences like an adult. I turned to Andrew, who seemed to have aged 10 years in the last few minutes. As for you, tomorrow I want the divorce papers in my hand, and I never want to see your face again. He tried to explain himself, say that Rachel had approached him, that it had been a momentary mistake, that he really loved me. His words went in one ear and out the other. At that moment, I could only think of one thing. How was I so blind? How didn't I see I was repeating exactly the same pattern, leaving a violent man to fall into the arms of another type of predator? One who smiled while manipulating, who spoke of love while betraying. Rachel packed a small bag in silence. When she was ready to leave, she stopped at the door and looked at me one last time. For an instant, I saw in her eyes a shadow of regret, maybe even fear. Then pride returned, hardening her gaze. Where? Am I going, Mom? That's your problem now, I replied, feeling each word tear at my throat. You're adult enough to seduce your mother's husband. You're adult enough to find somewhere to live. She left in the rain, which was now falling hard, without looking back. Andrew tried to follow, saying he'd resolve the situation, that he couldn't leave her alone on the street. I blocked the door with my body. If you go out this door after her, never come back. He hesitated, divided. For a moment, I thought he'd stay, that maybe there was a chance to understand what had happened, to process that betrayal. Then he grabbed his jacket and left too, shoulders bent under the weight of the rain and shame. I was left alone in that small room with the lace package still on the floor. Only then, when there was no one to witness, did I allow the tears to come. I cried until there were no more tears, until my whole body ached from the effort of sobbing. The next morning, with swollen eyes and a clear mind, I made two decisions. The first was to find a lawyer, not for the divorce, which at that time was almost impossible in America, but to file a formal complaint against Andrew. Rachel was 17, still a minor. What he did wasn't just a moral betrayal, it was a crime. The second decision was harder. I got the address of the mother of one of Rachel's friends from the factory, where I knew she'd probably sought shelter. I wrote a short letter informing her I'd filed a complaint against Andrew and that she should prepare to be called to testify. There was no anger in that letter, no accusations, just the cold facts of what had happened and what would happen next. You wanted to punish me for what you thought I did to you, I wrote at the end. But one day you'll understand that everything I did was to protect you. I hope that day comes before you make the same mistakes I did. The police went after Andrew the next day. He lost his job at the factory. The scandal spread quickly, the supervisor betrayed by the manager with her own teenage daughter. Some women looked at me with pity, others with that morbid curiosity of those who watch a disaster from afar, relieved it wasn't them. The legal process was humiliating. I found myself forced to lay bare my life to strangers in suits, to answer intrusive questions about my most intimate moments, and to endure veiled accusations that perhaps I had failed my husband or had not raised my daughter properly. Andrew received a conviction for corruption of a minor, a lenient sentence, but enough to shatter his reputation. Rachel refused to testify. Through a mutual acquaintance, I learned she had found work as a sales clerk at a downtown department store and rented a small room near the train station. She was moving forward just as I had, inadvertently, taught her all those years. When your world crumbles, you gather the pieces and rebuild. In the months that followed, I poured myself into my work. I saved every penny, resolute in my decision, never to depend on anyone again. I acquired a used sewing machine and began taking on small repairs and alterations in my free time to supplement my factory wages. Gradually, I built a steady clientele. Ladies needing dress adjustments, new curtains, minor mends. I relocated to a room in a different part of the city, a place where no one knew my story. I was starting over for the second time in a few years, but this time I was utterly alone. The solitude wasn't merely physical, it was the gaping void Rachel left behind. Regardless of her actions, she was my daughter, the girl I had cradled through feverish nights, for whom I had sung lullabies, for whom I had sacrificed everything. The agony of that betrayal was like a black hole within me, siphoning away all light, all hope. Some nights I'd wake up crying, dreaming she was still a little girl, that none of this had ever happened. Birthdays came and went, with me baking a cake as if she might suddenly appear at the door. Christmases saw me buying presents that remained wrapped in a drawer. Her absence inflicted a pain far deeper than any physical harm David had ever caused. I lived like that for a decade, 10 long years of silent grief for someone who was alive, yet had vanished from my life, as if she'd never existed. 10 years dedicated to constructing a new life, brick by painstaking brick. My modest home sewing operation grew into a small studio. I hired one assistant, then another. I established a reputation in the neighborhood as the reliable seamstress, with skilled hands and fair prices. And then, on a rainy day in 1982, eerily similar to that fateful day 10 years prior, someone knocked on my studio door after closing hours. It was a September afternoon in 1982. The rain fell steadily outside, transforming the streets of Lincoln Park into winding rivulets. My studio was already shut for the day. The last client had departed half an hour earlier, taking a party dress that needed urgent alterations for a weekend wedding. I was tidying up fabric scraps, sorting what could be repurposed for minor jobs, when I heard the knocking. My first thought was not to answer. After hours, it was usually just street vendors, seeking refuge from the rain or someone desperate for a last-minute repair that couldn't wait until morning. But the knocking persisted, insistent, almost frantic. When I opened the door, time simply stood still. There, drenched by the rain, clutching a baby precariously wrapped in a coat to shield it from the downpour, stood Rachel, my daughter. 10. Years older, face thinner, eyes carrying a tiredness that didn't match her 27 years, but it was her. We stood in silence for a long moment, just looking at each other. The baby started crying, a weak cry, muffled against her chest. It was that sound that broke the trance we were in. "Come in," I said, stepping aside. "You're soaked." She entered slowly, as if stepping on a minefield. She looked around the studio, the sewing machines organized in a row, the mannequins dressed, with pieces in progress, the shelves with fabrics carefully folded by color and texture, an entire life built without her. "You did it," she said softly. "Your own business." I nodded, still unable to fully process that she was there in front of me after so long. The baby cried again, louder this time. "She's hungry," she explained, eyes suddenly full of a panic. I recognized well. The desperation of a mother who doesn't know how to help her child. "I haven't eaten since yesterday." That's when I noticed the details the initial surprise had hidden. The yellowed bruise at the corner of her eye, the cut lip, poorly disguised with lipstick, the way she shrank slightly, as if expecting a blow at any moment. The same way I had years ago in David's presence. Without saying a word, I took the baby from her arms. It was a girl, I realized as I unwrapped the soaked coat. She couldn't have been more than a few months old, little eyes swollen from crying so much, cheeks red with fever. "Go take a hot shower." I indicated the hallway that led to the back, where my small apartment above the studio was. "There are clean towels in the bathroom cabinet. I'll prepare something for you to eat." She hesitated, looking at her daughter. In my arms. "I know how to take care of a baby, Rachel," I said, a sad smile on my lips. I've done it before. While she showered, I heated milk on the stove and looked for a bottle among the things I kept for emergencies. I always maintained some basic items for when the seamstresses who worked with me needed to bring their children. I rocked the little one, singing softly the same lullaby I used to sing to Rachel when she was a baby. The girl calmed almost immediately, sucking the milk eagerly. She had the same eyes as her mother, the same eyes I saw in the mirror every day. 3 generations of women united by their gaze, by blood, by pain. When Rachel came back, wearing an old nightgown of mine that had become huge on her body fragile, almost disappearing in the fabric. The little one was already sleeping, peacefully in my arms. I put the baby on the couch, improvising a little bed with pillows. "What's her name?" I asked, serving a plate of soup I'd heated. "Lucy," she answered, her voice almost a whisper. "Lucy Margaret." My heart tightened hearing my name there, preserved in her memory, passed on to the next generation. Despite everything, she hadn't completely erased me. Rachel ate in silence, her eyes alternating between her sleeping daughter and the plate. Only when she finished, her cheeks regaining a bit of color, did she finally say what she'd come to say. "Mom," she began, voice choked. "Now I understand." 3 simple words that carried the weight of a decade of separation, of pain, of regret. 3 words that opened the floodgates of 10 years of contained tears. "I understand why you fled with us that night. I understand what you sacrificed. I understand." She took a deep breath, tears flowing freely. "Now I understand how much I hurt you." I sat beside her, our hands almost touching on the table, but still separated by an abyss of painful memories. "What happened, Rachel?" The story she told, me in the following hours, was painfully familiar. After that day in 1972, she'd moved forward as she could. She got temporary jobs, lived in rented rooms, dropped out of school. Andrew had looked for her a few times after serving the light sentence he received, but she rejected him. "He meant nothing to me," she confessed, eyes lowered in shame. "It was just a way to hurt you." At 22, she met Robert, an older man, owner of a small transportation company. At first, he was kind, attentive, full of promises. They married quickly, she anxious for stability, for a home. In the first months, everything seemed like a dream. Their own house, a car in the garage, new clothes. And then, slowly, like water, that heats up gradually until it boils, the controls began, the demands, the jealousy. "The first slap came when I said I wanted to go back to school," she said, unconsciously touching her face as if the mark were still there. He apologized, cried, swore it would never happen again. I believed him. The pattern repeated, each time worse, each time more frequent. When she got pregnant with Lucy, she thought things would improve, that a baby would bring back the man she'd fallen in love with. But the girl's birth only made everything worse. More responsibilities, more stress, more reasons for violent explosions. "Last night," she continued, her voice firmer now, as if each word were a stone being removed from a heavy burden. "He threatened Lucy, said if I didn't stop her crying, he'd take care of her because he couldn't stand the noise anymore. That's when I realized I was living exactly what you lived with my father. And I understood, Mom. I understood everything at once." She told how she waited for him to fall asleep, how she took the baby and a small bag with documents, how she left in the middle of the night without looking back, how she walked for hours in the rain, aimlessly until her feet automatically brought her to my studio address, an address she'd kept all these years, cut from a small newspaper ad she'd seen by chance. "You knew where I was all this time?" I asked, surprised. She nodded, wiping away tears. "I'd pass by the front sometimes, just to make sure you were okay. I never had the courage to come in. The shame was too great." That night, Rachel and Lucy slept in my bed. I improvised a mattress on the floor for myself, but I could barely close my eyes. Every sound of their breathing, every small movement kept me alert, as if I feared they'd disappear if I slept. The next morning, we began to rebuild what had been destroyed 10 years before. It wasn't easy. There were deep wounds on both sides, words that couldn't be taken back, actions that couldn't be undone. Rachel was afraid Robert would come after her. I was afraid to open my heart again, only to see it broken. But we had Lucy, innocent, perfect, a new beginning. For her, we decided to try. In the first months, Rachel slept restlessly, waking at any noise on the street. I taught her how to file a complaint with the police, how to get a restraining order against Robert. I used the bitter experience I'd acquired years before to protect my daughter in a way I couldn't protect myself. Robert showed up at the studio, once, drunk, yelling at the door, demanding to see his wife, his daughter. The clients hid in the back, frightened. I picked up the phone calmly. I dialed the police right in front of him. "My daughter has a restraining order against this man," I said, looking him directly in the eyes. "He's violating the order right now." Something in my gaze, the firmness of a woman who had faced men like him before and survived, made him back. Down. He left before the police arrived and never came back. Gradually, a new routine was established. Rachel started helping in the studio, revealing a talent for sewing she'd inherited from me. Her presence attracted younger clientele, bringing fresh ideas for the designs. At night, we took turns caring for Lucy, who grew strong and healthy, filling the house with laughter that had been absent for a long time. In 1983, with business prospering, we managed to rent a larger space on the same street. It was no longer just an alteration studio. Now we made custom dresses, suits, even wedding dresses. We hired 2 more seamstresses, installed new machines. It was Rachel who suggested the name for the sign out front. Margaret and Rachel Fashion and Alterations. The first time I saw those words painted, our names together, side by side, I felt such great emotion I could barely speak. "We built this together, Mom," she said, hugging me by the shoulders as we looked at the freshly painted facade. A second chance for both of us. In 1985, we took another important step. After saving for years, we bought the building where the studio operated. It wasn't big, but it was ours, really ours. Upstairs, we renovated the apartment, creating a special room for Lucy, who was already 3 years old and talked nonstop, charming clients with her made-up stories. "Grandma, tell me again how you and Mommy made dresses for princesses," she'd ask at night while I put her to bed. And I'd tell her, transforming our story of struggle into a fairy tale she could understand. The difficult parts, the violence, the betrayal, the separation were left out. There would be time for harder truths when she was older. One day, while we were arranging the fabric stock, Rachel found an old box at the back of the closet. Inside, carefully folded, was the piece of lace I'd bought on that fateful day in 1972. The lace that should have been for my wedding dress, that had fallen to the floor when I discovered the betrayal. "You kept this all this time?" she asked, holding the delicate fabric as if it were something precious and fragile. "I kept many things," I replied, thinking of the uncelebrated birthdays, the undelivered gifts, the unspoken words, some visible, others not. She was silent for a moment, her fingers tracing the intricate patterns of the lace. "Can we use it?" she finally said, "for Lucy's first communion dress, something old transformed into something new." And so we did. The lace that should have witnessed the beginning of a family that never existed ended up adorning the celebration of a family we built from the ashes of that pain. Life has these ironies, sometimes cruel, sometimes redemptive. The years went by. Lucy grew strong, intelligent, protected by the love of 2 women who knew the value of safety, of stability. Rachel went back to school, graduated in fashion design through a night course. I aged, hair whitening, hands wrinkling, but still firm enough for the most delicate work in the studio. In 1990, we expanded the business, opening a small school, uniform factory in the neighboring district. In 1995, we started giving sewing classes to women from the periphery, many of them fleeing situations similar to what we'd experienced. It was our way of giving back, of transforming our pain into something useful for others. Each woman we help support herself, Rachel would explain to the students on the first day, is a woman who can say no when she needs to, a woman who can protect her children, a woman who can start over. And as she spoke, I saw in her eyes the reflection of my own, the eyes of someone who fell, got up, and learned to walk again. Someone who knew the worst of life and still chose to believe in the best. The pain never completely disappeared. There are scars that time doesn't erase. It only teaches you to live with them. On stormy nights, I still wake up startled, sometimes nightmares taking me back to that small room, that betrayal, that loss. Rachel also has her ghosts, waking up calling for Lucy in the middle of the night, checking the locks 2-3 times before sleeping. But we learned that scars are also maps, marks that show where we've been, what we've survived, how we got here. They're reminders that pain passes, that wounds heal, that there's always a tomorrow waiting for us, no matter how dark the night. And now in 2025, looking back at that young 34-year-old mother who fled with her daughter on a rainy night, at that 37-year-old woman who faced the worst imaginable betrayal, at that 47-year-old grandmother who opened the door to a new beginning, I realize it was worth every tear, every sacrifice, every new start, because today, at 75, I have what many never achieve, a second chance, a daughter who understood, forgave, and was forgiven. A granddaughter who grew up surrounded by love, now graduated in law, defending other women in the courts, and a legacy of strength that will continue long after I'm gone. If you're watching this and identified with any part of my story, I want you to know there's hope for you too. There's also a tomorrow waiting. There's also the possibility of healing, of starting over, of forgiveness. Because if there's something I've learned in these 75 years, it's that we're stronger than we imagine, more resilient than we believe, more capable of loving again than we dream. Life isn't always fair, isn't always easy, but it's always, always an opportunity to start over. When I look at my hands today, I see the map of my story. The small scars from needles that slipped, the age spots, the blue veins that stand out under the thin skin, hands that rocked a daughter and then a granddaughter, that sewed not just fabrics, but also scraps of a shattered life. Hands that learned to let go, to hold again, and finally to bless. The 2000s brought changes that neither Rachel nor I could have imagined when we started our little studio. Technology transformed the world, and we had to adapt to not be left behind. Lucy, already graduated in law, insisted we needed to have a website, something that seemed completely strange to a lady who grew up listening to radio dramas. "Grandma, you need to show your work to more people," she explained with that infinite patience young people have with old folks who don't understand the modern world. Think how many women could be inspired by your story. We resisted at first. Of course, Rachel and I were women of fabric and thread, not computers and internet, but Lucy was persistent, another characteristic she inherited from both of us, for better or worse. In 2002, she created our first website with photos of the studio, the pieces we made, and a small biography of us. The story behind the seams, she called it. At first, it seemed just a curiosity, something to please the enthusiastic granddaughter. But then emails started arriving. Women from all over America writing to say how they were inspired by our journey. Young fashion students wanting to learn from us, and most surprisingly, women in domestic violence situations seeking courage to take the same step I took in 1969 when I took Rachel and fled in the middle of the night. "Mom," Rachel told me one night, as we read together another one of these emotional emails, "I think we need to do more than just make clothes." That's how, at 67, when many people are already thinking about retirement, I started a new phase of my life. We transformed part of our studio into a support space for women victims of violence. It wasn't an official shelter. We didn't have the structure or authorization for that, but a place where they could learn a trade, gain financial independence, and find the support they needed to rebuild their lives. We named it Project Fresh Start. We offered free courses in basic sewing, embroidery, small repairs, skills that could generate immediate income for women who often left home with just the clothes on their backs and children in their arms. Lucy contributed with legal guidance, explaining rights, helping with restraining orders, referring to public defenders when necessary. Rachel revealed herself to be a natural teacher, patient, attentive, able to see the hidden potential in the most insecure students. She understood, like no one else, the fear that paralyzed those women, the shame that prevented them from believing in themselves. After all, she'd been on the other side of the table, learning from me to rebuild her self-esteem after Robert. When you can transform a piece of fabric into something beautiful and useful, she'd tell the students on the first day, you realize you can also transform your own life. I preferred to stay behind the scenes, taking care of the administrative part, ensuring we had enough materials, helping during busier times. But sometimes, when one of the women seemed especially lost or hopeless, Rachel would call me. Mom, tell your story to Denise or to Joan or to Sandra. And I'd tell them, not the embellished version people expect to hear, but the raw truth, the fear, the pain, the betrayal, and mainly the long and difficult journey of reconstruction. It's going to hurt, I'd always say, looking into their eyes. It's going to hurt more than you imagine. There will be days when you'll want to give up, go back, pretend nothing happened. But if you persist, if you keep taking one step at a time, even when your legs seem unable to take anymore, one day you'll look back and barely recognize the woman you were. By 2005, Project Fresh Start had already helped more than 100 women. Some stayed with us just long enough to learn the basics and continue on their way. Others became a permanent part of our team, expanding the business, bringing new ideas, new talents. It was one of these women, Carmen, not my sister, but a young mother of 3 who had fled from a violent husband in Texas, who suggested we start documenting our stories. Mrs. Margaret, she said, with that southern accent she never lost. You should write a book, or at least record your story, so it doesn't get lost. At first, I laughed at the idea. Who would want to hear the memories of an old seamstress? What importance would my small personal struggles have in the grand scheme of things? But Lucy, always connected with the innovations of the digital world, had another idea. Grandma, what if we made short videos, just you telling parts of your story? We could post them on the internet. I resisted fiercely at first. The idea of exposing myself that way, of publicly reliving such painful moments of my life, seemed unthinkable. Besides, I'd never been a person who sought the spotlight. My whole life had been built backstage, sewing in silence, rebuilding in silence, loving in silence. What if it helps other women, Mom? Rachel asked gently one night when we were discussing the subject for the umpteenth time. What if your story gives courage to someone who's going through what we went through? That question kept echoing in my head for days. What if? What if my words could reach someone who was exactly where I was in 1969 or in 1972? Someone at rock bottom, without hope, not knowing it's possible to start over, that it's possible to build something beautiful from the ruins. In 2007, we recorded the first video in the back room of the studio. Lucy positioned the camera. Rachel fixed my hair and gave me a glass of water. My hands were shaking so much I nearly spilled the water. Standing before the camera, I suddenly forgot everything I'd intended to say. Just speak from your heart, Grandma. Lucy guided me, that smile always reminding me of the little girl she once was. Imagine you're talking to one of our students, a woman who needs to hear exactly what you have to say. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and began to speak. I recounted the night I fled with Rachel in the rain, the years of struggle in Chicago, the betrayal, the separation, the 10 years of loneliness, and finally the reunion, the forgiveness, the rebuilding. When I finished, I realized Rachel was silently crying in a corner of the room. Lucy had teary eyes behind the camera, and I myself felt a strange lightness, as if I'd finally put down a heavy burden I'd carried for too long. That first video, posted by Lucy on a site called YouTube, only had a few dozen views, mostly her. Friends, studio acquaintances, and women from the Fresh Start Project. But among the comments, one touched me deeply. "I watched this in the shelter house, where I'm hiding with my children. Thank you for showing me there's an after." An after. Two simple words that summed up everything I wanted to convey. That after the storm, after the pain, after the betrayal, there is an after. It might be different from what we imagine, perhaps harder, perhaps lonelier, but it exists. And in that after, we can build something new. We continued recording videos, sporadically in the following years. It never went viral, as Lucy explained some things on the internet do. They were just simple stories from an elderly lady sharing her life, her struggles, her discoveries. But gradually, a small community formed around those videos. Women of different ages and places, united by the shared experience of pain and hope. In 2010, I received a surprising invitation. An organization that worked with women who were victims of violence wanted me to give a talk at their annual event. Me, who had never spoken in public beyond our small circle at the studio, was now faced with an audience of specialists, social workers, lawyers. "I can't do this," I said immediately. "I'm not an expert in anything. I'm just a seamstress who lived what she lived." "That's exactly why they want you, Mom," Rachel insisted. "They have plenty of experts. What they don't have is someone who went through the fire and came out the other side to tell the story." At 75, trembling with nervousness, I walked onto the stage in that packed auditorium. My notes were so crumpled from squeezing them so much I could barely read. I looked at the audience and saw Rachel and Lucy in the front row, smiling, giving me courage. And beside them, faces of women who had gone through the Fresh Start Project, some of whom now had their own businesses, their own stories of rebuilding. "I'm not an expert," I began, my voice trembling into the microphone. "I don't have fancy degrees on my wall or published books. All I have is my story. And if it helps illuminate the path for just one soul in this room, then my presence here will have been worth it." I spoke for nearly an hour, losing all sense of time. I shared the fear that paralyzes, the shame that silences, the guilt that consumes, but also the inner strength we unearth when we have no other choice. I spoke of the dignity in building from scratch and the profound beauty of forgiveness, both given and received. When I finished, the auditorium fell into such a profound silence that for a moment I feared I had made a terrible mistake. Then slowly, one person rose, then another, and another, until the entire audience was on their feet, applauding not just my words, but my journey, the very life I had lived. That first talk opened doors to many others, small community gatherings, support group meetings, and even an international conference on women's rights. I, who had spent most of my life hidden, terrified of drawing attention, now used my voice to guide others. For my 80th birthday in 2015, Rachel and Lucy threw a surprise party at the studio. When I arrived, expecting just another workday, I found the place adorned with flowers and photographs. There were pictures of me as a young woman with little Rachel, photos of our first studio, and images of the hundreds of women who had found new beginnings through the Fresh Start Project. Over the years, in the center of the room sat a huge cake, and beside it, a book bound in my favorite blue fabric. When I opened it, I discovered it was an album filled with letters. Letters from women across the country who had watched my videos, attended my talks, or simply heard my story from others. "Mrs. Margaret," one letter read, "we've never met, but your story saved me. I was about to go back to my abusive husband when a friend showed me your video. Today, I own my own beauty salon, and my daughters are safe. Thank you for showing me. It was possible." Another note said, "Dear Mrs. Margaret, I'm a social worker, and I use your videos in all the support groups I lead. Women connect with your story in a way they can't with any textbook or technical lecture. You speak their language, the language of survival and hope. There were dozens of these letters, each one a testament to how my simple narrative, the story of an ordinary woman who faced what so many endure, had touched lives, altered destinies, and even saved entire families. I looked at Rachel, now 60 years old, with the first silver strands appearing in her dark hair. At Lucy, a 43-year-old woman, a respected lawyer and mother of 2 children who are the absolute light of my life. At the women from the Fresh Start Project, some of whom had been with us for over a decade. And finally, at the photos on the walls, the visual chronicle of the life we built from the ashes of so much suffering. "How did we get here?" I whispered to Rachel, clutching her hand as tears streamed down my wrinkled face. "One step at a time, Mom," she replied, with that smile that always brought back memories of the girl she once was. One day at a time, one stitch at a time. And she was absolutely right, of course. There was no single grand moment of transformation, no sudden miracle, just the stubborn resolve to keep pushing forward when all seemed lost. To believe that after the darkest night, the sun will always rise again. Today, at 90 years old, I don't sew like I used to. My hands no longer have the firmness necessary for delicate work, but I still go to the studio almost every day. I sit in a corner, watching the younger women work, offering advice here, a word of encouragement there. Project Fresh Start has grown beyond what we ever imagined, helping hundreds of women each year. Rachel, now 70, is starting to talk about retiring, about passing the business administration to Lucy, and some of the women who grew up with us. We laugh together about this, because we both know it's just talk. She loves what she does too much to really stop. When I look back at the long road I've traveled, I clearly see the breaking points. That rainy night in 1969 when I fled with Rachel. The devastating day in 1972 when I discovered the betrayal. The afternoon in 1982 when Rachel knocked on my door with Lucy in her arms, moments when the world I knew completely collapsed. But I also see the reconstruction points. The first paycheck at the garment factory, the first piece I sewed in my own studio, the day Rachel and I hung the sign with our names together, the first woman we helped through Project Fresh Start, the first video we recorded, the first letter we received from someone who felt touched by our story. And I realized that life isn't a straight line, smoothly advancing from one point to another. It's a complex fabric with tears and patches, visible and invisible seams. A fabric we shape with our choices, our pains, our loves, our persistence. If you're listening to me now, maybe you're going through one of these breaking moments. Maybe your world has recently collapsed, an abusive relationship, a betrayal, a devastating loss. Maybe you're wondering how to move forward, how to rebuild something from the ruins. I want you to know it's possible. It won't be easy, it won't be quick, and it certainly won't be without pain, but it's possible. I'm living proof of that. Rachel is living proof of that. Each of the women who passed through Project Fresh Start is living proof of that. One step at a time, one day at a time, one stitch at a time. And one day, when you look back, you'll see not just what you lost, but mainly what you built. Not just the scars, but the beauty that emerged from them. Not just the pain of the past, but the strength of the present and the hope for the future. This is the most precious lesson I've learned in my 90 years of life. We can be broken, but never destroyed. We can be torn, but we can always be mended. And the patches, far from diminishing us, only add character, history, and beauty to the fabric of our lives. Thank you for listening to this old seamstress's story. If it touched your heart in any way, share it with someone who might need to hear that there is an after, that there is hope, that there is a fresh start. And now, please, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Which part of my story touched you most? And if you can, leave a like and subscribe to the channel so we can reach more women who need to hear they're not alone.